a neuroscientist and clinical psychologist,
Okay.
and I work in Illinois.
And I have a lot of
Okay.
questions to ask you, and I was wondering if you minded if I recorded this.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, great. Regarding hell, there's some sources that say that it's an infrequent experience, but there's other sources, quite a few, that suggest that suicide attempts experience hell. 1% of all near-death experiences experience hellish ones, but then it goes on. It goes on to quote and Ring and Sabin, 1982, 1984, 1978, that these experiences might be suppressed or even not shared. In fact, in one of your references that I read, it reported that that people took twice as long or 3 times as long to report hellish experiences than regular ones. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because when we are interacting with the environment in kind of a normal, not extraordinary state, and I refer to extraordinary state as some state outside of our typical consciousness, we generally view the world through a negative lens.
Okay.
You know, and so this is what we see in most of our psychiatric populations, whether they are substance users, patients with depression, patients with anxiety, and even people who are beginning to dement. Most of their life experiences are negative in nature.
Right, okay.
You know, they view that. And so...
so negative experiences can then lead in the near-death experiences, because I read that, and I've read several articles that suggest that. So the negative experience in their life when they have near-death experiences can result in hellish ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be my hypothesis. Again, you know, I do not study the topic because I don't have access to such data.
Right.
But I have, you know, I see patients daily, and I have some patients who contemplate suicide, and I explore those ideas and thoughts in depth.
Well, you see, you don't have information on it, but the paper you wrote was clearly well written.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's my take on neuroscience of this process.
Right.
So, you know, I'm very familiar with brain networks, and that plus clinical experience and imaging data that I published myself, you know, kind of lead me in the direction of certain understanding of that process.
Okay.
It's not empirically verified by my own data, but there are data out there where it makes sense. So
right, and you mentioned the mental illness, and that brings up a very big question for me. Is mental illness related to near-death experiences? So far, the data I've collected shows that mental illness versus the general population has no categorization with psychiatric patients. Like psychiatric patients experience no more near-death experiences than anybody else. But I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's also my experience. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that perhaps more normal the person is going into that experience, the more vivid and perhaps positive experience
for psychiatric patients.
No, for normal people who do not have psychiatric presentation.
Okay, so psychiatric patients don't experience this any more or any less.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
Okay, and in your paper you mentioned that drugs was a relation, and I thought that was very, you know, that would be an obvious factor. I actually read a paper that was a little biased, but it showed that 50% of people studied with near-death experience had used drug or alcohol that day. But then I have several citations and sources that indicate that drugs actually do not affect that, which is hard for me to understand and believe. What is your thoughts on this? I mean, because they say the drugs actually dull the experience, and they do not affect them. It's an interesting. It's hard for me to understand. How that could be. How that could be. In fact, in the Susan J. Blackmore indicates that drugs do not influence. But another study shows, like I said, that 50% of all of patients were on drugs or alcohol. What is your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so it has to do with how do you conceptualize that process. So my definition, and that's what I was driven by in my paper, was that you kind of eliminate contribution of the brain activity in that experience. So it is actually not biologically brain-related experience. And I was gentle about making that statement clearly, but in the studies where there is brain death as identified by flat EEG,
okay,
right, when heart has stopped,
right,
based on biological definition of death, that is death. So there is no, so if you brought someone into the emergency room and they did EEG and they did EKG and found that both of them were non-active, and they would pronounce someone as being
so
dead.
Okay. At that point, drugs would not have an effect then.
Exactly.
So there could be cases where drugs do have an effect, and there are clearly cases where drugs are not at all affect the near death.
In a very pure sense, it all depends on how you define death.
Right.
So some some reports may indicate that individuals may have been at the edge of near-death experience, but
right.
not fully there.
Okay.
Which may be impacted by drugs, but when you cross that threshold of physiological inactivity, then drugs have no effect.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, great. Well, while we're talking on a technical note, okay, so you suggest that the white and gray matter in the brain could be damaged, which could cause near-death experiences, and the white and gray matter in the brain. I found that very broad, and then I read further, and you discussed the frontal lobes. What I'm assuming you're surrounding this around is the limbic system. Am I correct? In the hippocampus?
Well, hippocampus is not. Hippocampus is part of the limbic system, but not the driver of the limbic system. Hippocampus is involved, but the driver of the limbic system is the amygdala.
Okay.
Amygdala is the detector of danger, detector of the emotional experience. So for example, in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder who relive traumatic experiences are driven by amygdala, which then sends the information to prefrontal cortex, and then that information is processed and experienced by the person.
Okay.
Hippocampus plays a role in kind of establishing memory of that process, and once that memory is established, hippocampus plays a role in either creating that memory or retrieving parts of that memory.
Okay. And I'm assuming the white and gray brain matter, from what my research, is damaged from anoxia?
Yeah, so the brain depends on oxygen and glucose. So
right.
If you decrease oxygen tension in the brain, the tissue becomes anoxic, and if the temperature is body temperature, the physiological processes occur, and then there is release of excitatory neurotransmitters.
Right.
And then that is overexcited, and then there is brain death as a consequence of overexcitation. So that can happen. When the temperatures are low, that process is slowed, and that's why people who drown in the cold water have a greater ability to survive without oxygen for a longer period of time, and that's why during surgical procedures, the temperatures are generally decreased, body temperatures.
Wait, I'm confused. They decrease the temperatures because
so metabolism is directly related to the temperature.
Okay.
As you decrease the temperature, metabolism decreases, which means that the injurious process is slowed down.
So the white and the gray and white brain matter, does that regenerate over time, or is
Good
it
question.
damaged?
It all depends. It all depends on the age of the person and where the damage is. So, for example, if you have injury to hippocampus,
Yeah.
probability of regeneration is high. If you had damage to basal ganglia, for example, and I'm picking that structure because we don't have data on it, recovery probably will not be as complete.
Okay, and what does that mean for the person?
I'm sorry?
What does that mean for the person if it does not regenerate?
Well, brain is plastic, which means flexible, and so if there is an injury to brain region, the brain has a potential for rewiring itself in such a way as to compensate for that function.
Okay,
so you may have someone with stroke who with practice will be able to use the arm, even though the area of the brain that controls that arm is no longer present. And the only reason why that happens is because the system rewires
restructuring.
Yeah,
I got you. Okay. Okay. Out-of-body experiences. A 1982 study by Carr suggests endorphins do the opposite. So I have studies that show endorphins are actually cause out-of-body experiences, but then there's studies that show the opposite. What's with that?
Okay. Remember how you define this process, and I think it is dangerous to kind of take all the studies and pull them together, because if you really want to study that experience, you need to make sure that physiologically the brain is no longer functioning.
Okay.
If there is some function, then of course all the factors that you mentioned, such as drugs and endorphins and enkephalins and all of those may play a role in the process.
Okay, so
right?
it's what I define as death.
Yeah.
Okay, so even serotonin could play a role, but if they're dead, if we consider them dead and their hearts stop, their brain's inactive, then serotonin would no longer play a role. The endorphins would no longer play a role. All of these things could be altered based on this, correct?
Correct. And so then the issue is there such a thing as a soul?
Right, which is a very interesting issue.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a very interesting issue. Is there a soul? I actually have studied. Okay, so people who die who are Christians see Jesus a lot. But people in other countries who study other religions see their gods, and that's a interesting notion. I just wondered what you thought on that.
Well, I think they see something, and when they come back, they need to interpret what is it that they saw. Okay. I think in most cases they don't say, they don't go up to that deity and say, "Who are you? Are you Moses, or are you Jesus, or are you Muhammad?" They see that something.
And they associate that with their religion.
Right.
I gotcha. 48% of individuals reported near-death experiences at night, and a larger majority experienced a slowing of time. I'm curious why, if you have any idea why 48% of the individuals would report these things happening at night, and what causes the slowing of time?
Well, time is a very
tricky matter.
Interesting. It's an interesting process because we have innate ability to detect time, and that the time is detected by certain brain structures that rely on our biological functions. So heartbeat is a metronome. So our brain understands that there are heartbeats that are occurring, and it gives us internal pacemaker as in terms of evaluating what time is.
Okay.
And so once you get rid of that, then the brain gets confused as to so where's the timing device? When you turn that off or slow that down, the brain gets confused as to how to interpret that.
Well, okay, that makes sense. And why are these individuals reporting that the majority occur at night? Now, this is one report, and I'm slightly biased, but from what I gathered, it does happen more at night, and I'm wondering if that has if that's just random or just a fluke, or if there's something in the body that occurs that Why would the majority of NDEs, near-death experiences, occur during night?
Well, several potential hypotheses.
Okay.
One is night is generally um, there's a limited external input during the night.
Right.
So the body kind of experiences somewhat of a sensory deprivation. That's number one. Number two, there is internal clock and circadian rhythm in the body. The body knows when it's time to shift. And when the body shifts into a sleep state, that becomes a very different process in the brain. As a matter of fact, sleep is very highly metabolically active. We think of sleep as being restful, which it is for the body, but it's not necessarily restful for the brain. So brain is really charged with significant amount of energy that needs to be put out in order to reorganize thought processes and so on.
Okay.
And so as you increase the demand on the brain, if the brain is vulnerable, you would probably, push it a little bit too far, and you may go into quote unquote death process, and that may be the reason.
That makes sense. Of course, all of these things are hypotheses. We don't know for sure, but some of this stuff really seems to make sense. But I read some literature not long ago, changing the subject, that cases over and over of people who had near-death, out-of-body experiences, which is slightly different from near-death experiences.
Yeah.
But these out-of-body experiences in which they could see things, and they actually, after they were saved, they could name things, and they could list things in the room. They could tell things from the monitors, and just freaky things. Do you think that's just all flukes and sensationalism?
No. I think there is something there that we don't understand.
I gotcha. So this does happen, and those reports are true.
Well, yeah, definitely. There have been reports written in very reputable journals,
right,
where people tried to really investigate that thoroughly, because as you could imagine, if you write a paper like this and there are flaws, your reputation goes out the window.
Right.
So people are very careful before they publish to make sure that what they write is true. Otherwise, this would be very detrimental to one's career.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, okay. So back to the suicide thing. I mentioned it briefly. So suicide victims, according to one study, show that they have more experiences with hellish experience. Another study says that it's actually less than the people who commit suicide are actually experience less hellish experiences than others. And then on top of that, 1% by Ring in 1984 study estimated accounts for unpleasant experiences out of hundreds of people. Full-blown negative experiences have not been really located or identified. So he says that he estimates 1%. And I was wondering what you thought about that on suicide. Do they experience more hellish experiences?
Okay, so the question is, again, how far did they go? Obviously, if someone is successful in suicide, then they can't report on it.
Right.
Which means, how far down did they go in terms of brain death? And I could imagine that the reason why people commit suicide is because there is significant negative valence that drives that process.
Okay, so once again, the negative. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know of any cases of someone being so extraordinarily high that they want to commit suicide. It's always the negative, the right hemisphere function that drives suicide.
So you agree that suicide has more hellish experiences?
Yeah, particularly if someone survives it, because
right.
They get. I'm sure that there is fear associated with the process, and often people that I spoke with who try to commit suicide, once they do something, there is this tremendous fear of why have I done that?
Okay.
And so that may drive that hellish experience.
Well, do you think it's more than 1% of experiences of near-death experience? Do you think 1% is accurate for the hellish experiences?
I would not know.
Okay. And there was also indication that people would there's less suicide attempts after near-death experiences. Is that true?
I would say yes, because if um, that experience is positive, they begin to recognize the power of spiritual process that they have not in the past.
Okay.
So they look at life from a very different vantage point, and that's why I think in doing psychotherapy and other psychological interventions or psychiatric interventions need to include spiritual process.
Okay.
Because we are made to be spiritual beings.
Right.
And so
I find that fun.
Ignore that.
We ignore that?
I said if we ignore that,
okay.
Then the life kind of doesn't make sense in many situations.
I find it very unique that you incorporate spirituality because, as you know, most psychologists and psychiatrists are either agnostic or atheists. So, well, in my experience, when dealing with
that is true, but I began as a basic scientist.
Okay.
So I spent many years in the laboratory and recognized that the more we know, more we recognize that we don't know, and there are processes in play that we have no explanation for, and perhaps we will one day. But eliminating the probability that there is a soul and there is other processes that we can't measure at this time is okay with me. I don't struggle with that.
Right. So in your actual practice, you incorporate spirituality with your patients?
Yes.
And is that effective?
Yes.
And by spirituality, you don't necessarily name a religion, but it's the actual process of becoming peace with your soul and
well, actually,
explain
I don't go there that way. What I do is I ask people whether or not they have a belief system.
Right.
And if the answer is yes, then I explore that, and then I practice in the light of their conceptual understanding of what that belief system is. So there becomes another platform at which one can provide therapeutic intervention. It's not just here and now, but rather the bigger picture and bigger platform. So it gives me another dimension to work with.
And you find that that's more effective than just doling out medicine and cognitive behavioral therapy?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so you've seen that in your practice that people respond to spirituality within the therapy.
Yes, and often they are surprised because, as you said, most of the people in the profession don't talk about it. So there are two things.
Right. They never. Yeah.
Don't talk about. One is spirituality, and the other one is sexuality. Those two things are generally avoided in most therapeutic processes.
Well, what are your thoughts on sexuality in regards to spirituality?
Well, I think one has to understand from the point of view of one's belief system what sexuality is about, what's the purpose, what's the meaning. It's obviously a very significant and intense experience for most, and many people have difficulties managing this process. And if they don't understand how that plays a role in how they perceive themselves, how they perceive relationships, how they perceive the world, So.
Well, that makes sense. So when people have near-death experiences, they usually become more spiritual. That's very interesting. But are we ever going to be able to find the absolute answer of what is happening when people die and come back, or is this there's a question I would like to ask you if you've heard of this. It's there's two systems that people that they weight the individuals. I'm wondering if you heard of this. Let's see if I can find it.
Oh, you mean the body weight?
Scale. No,
body weight.
Not weight. But there are two formats in which people they look at the patients who have near-death experiences and identify whether there's scales for identifying
Oh.
what they've gone through. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you mean behavior, kind of self-report measures.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Weighted Core Index by Ring 1980 and the NDE Scale Grayson 1983.
Yeah.
Are those accurate? That's difficult to say.
I guess define accurate. I think the attempt is always to become systematic in your exploration. I think that's the point of all those questionnaires. You want to be able to define your terminology and define what is it that you're really talking about.
Right.
And so I think as far as that is concerned, yes, they're accurate because that's all that we have.
That's all we have.
And ultimately, something that has been around for a long time gains a status of some reliability.
Right.
Whether that's ultimately true, I don't know, because we have no gold standard against which to measure that. So,
so it's what we got now. It's what we use. I got you.
Yeah.
Well, last but not least, medieval Christian literature describes horrifying experiences of hell. Now, there are Christian in the medieval times. There are accounts of near-death experiences where they experience hell, even not near-death experiences. In fact, I've discovered that near-death experiences generally come when there's not near-death. Is that true? Just real quick, is that true?
Probably true. Yeah, I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
But
well, yeah. Okay. I just wanted that quick answer. But anyway, continuing. So Christians reported this. Now, in our current society, there's less reports of hellish experiences. I know I keep going back to the hellish part, but that's really fascinating. So these Christians back in the Middle Ages, they would write. There's written literature on it, and there's a large amount of cases where they experience hellish experiences. Why in our current community is this dissipated? Has this dissipated?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with desensitization. So if you look at current media, the images that were created by verbal description probably are not as intense as the visual experiences that our current media can generate.
Okay.
So people experience hell daily.
Yeah.
Just flip, and so hell is no longer such a horrific place because it's here 24/7 in the on television and the movies and in all of that. And I think part of it has to do with that process.
From your point of view, do you think there is an afterlife from what you've seen and what you've witnessed? Because
yes, I believe there is afterlife.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate all your answers and all your help. I'm hoping I can send the paper to you when it's getting complete, and I hope I can email you questions if they arise.
Sure, that would be fine.
Well, thank you, Dr. Konopaka.